If you're seeking asylum in the United States, then this message is for you. The US government's gonna ask you tons of questions, and you've got to answer them in a way that shows that you meet all the requirements for a grant of asylum. So it's not easy. If you don't do a good job in answering these questions, then you simply won't get asylum and you could end up being deported. So let me ask you, how would you like to know ahead of time the questions that you're going to be asked in your asylum case? So in a special free training, I'm gonna tell you the questions you can expect in your asylum case. If we're just now meeting, I'm Brian Manning, and I used to be an asylum officer with the government, but now as an asylum lawyer, well, I help immigrants all over the country to secure their future in America through asylum. Now, I've conducted thousands of immigration interviews as an immigration officer with the US government, so I know what you can expect to be asked in your asylum case. And I'm sharing this with you in this exclusive free training. Let's go to the training. Hey there, and welcome to a very special training, 428 questions to expect in your asylum case. I'm Brian Manning, I'm a political asylum lawyer. I used to be an asylum officer, but now, as a lawyer, I help people from all over the country to secure their future in the United States through asylum. So we're going to cover in this pretty detailed, pretty extensive training, the questions that you can expect to be asked by the US government in your asylum case. All right. So this is broken up into several sections. I'm going to give you kind of an overview, and then we're going to go into questions that you're going to get as part of the review of your asylum application and kind of preliminary discussions that the asylum officer or the judge in your immigration court case will do with you. And then we're going to go over past harm questions. Usually the asylum officer will start the substantive questions with past harm, asking you about anything that's happened to you in the past where you've been harmed. And then they'll ask you questions about any long-lasting consequences or harm that you've suffered, stuff that still plagues you today, or maybe at least kept affecting you for a long time from those incidents of past harm. And then they're going to look towards the future, and they're going to ask you questions about threats or circumstances that indicate that you're likely to be harmed in the future. So what is it that will convince the judge or the asylum officer that, yeah, you're still at risk? If you go back to your country, there's still a really good chance that you're going to be harmed. And then they'll ask you questions concerning the nexus requirement. What does that mean? Well, remember, if you've seen any of my other trainings, you already know this, but to win asylum, it's not enough to show that you've been persecuted or that you're likely to be persecuted in the future. Rather, you also have to show that the reason that the bad guys are harming you is because you possess one of the 5 protected characteristics under asylum law. And those are sometimes called the protected grounds. Those are your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or something called membership in a particular social group. So at some point during your asylum interview or asylum hearing, you're going to get asked questions so that the decision maker, the officer or the judge, can try to figure out what the motivation is on the persecutor side that is causing them to target you. Okay. And so then we're going to go over questions that you're going to get if the persecutors are not from the government. In other words, if they are private actors, meaning like they don't work for the government, you're going to get some specific questions about that topic. Why? Because there's a little bit more that you have to show to win asylum if the government is not the persecutor. And I'll say more about that when we get to that section. And then at the end of your asylum interview, you'll get some kind of wrap-up questions that they just always ask people. So that's what you can expect. Really, anyone can expect to get these questions at their asylum interview. Okay. And then we're going to go to some more specific topics that don't apply to everyone, but they may apply to you depending on the facts of your case. We're going to go over questions that you might get concerning internal relocation. This is where you may be able to just go somewhere else in your country and be safe. If the officer thinks that, you know what, they could just move somewhere else and be okay, then you won't get asylum. And this is especially relevant where the persecutor is not the government. Okay. When it's a private actor, you do have to show the officer, look, I can't really be safe anywhere, or there's at least some good reason why I shouldn't be expected to move. It would not be reasonable for me to go to wherever I could be safe. Okay. So they're going to ask lots of questions about that if the government is not the persecutor. And then you may have questions about firm resettlement. This is when after leaving your country, but before arriving in the United States, you go to a third country, some other country where you're physically present in that country if you have permanent status in that third country, meaning like permanent residence or asylum or some status that allows you to stay permanently, then you will not get asylum in the United States due to the firm resettlement bar. The idea is, look, you were firmly resettled in this other country. You could have just stayed there. You should have stayed there. Why would we give you protection here when you already had it somewhere else? You could have just stayed there. Okay, so if you were in another country after leaving your country, but before coming to the United States, you definitely need to check out these questions we're going to cover regarding firm resettlement. Even if you did not have permanent residence or you think that what you had was not permanent residence, the asylum officer might think differently, and they're going to ask you a lot of questions about this topic if you are living or even really present at all in any other country after leaving your country but before coming to the United States. And then we've got the 1-year filing deadline. So as you may know, to get asylum, normally you have to file during your first year in the United States. If you don't do that, you will not get asylum unless one of 2 general categories of exceptions applies in your case. So if you filed your application more than 1 year after your most recent arrival in the United States, you definitely need to check out these 1-year filing deadline questions, okay? And then we're going to go into some specific case types or specific things that come up in certain cases based on the facts of the case. Like if you were ever arrested or detained, you're going to get certain questions. If you were involved in political activities, you're probably going to get questions along the lines of what I'll cover today. And then for people who are sexual minorities, meaning members of the LGBTQ plus community, you can expect certain questions. And then there's religious conversion cases where you fear being harmed because you changed religions. There's family-based persecution, meaning if you're being targeted because of your family, because the bad guys don't like your family and they're going after you because of it, or basically if you were not a member of this particular family, you would not be targeted, but you are being targeted, you're definitely going to get some specific questions about that. We'll go over domestic violence cases, meaning like abuse by a partner, spouse, or a parent in the home, female genital mutilation, and then cases where there's gang activity, when you're being threatened or harmed by a gang. All of these are very common asylum case types. And so we're going to go over some specific questions for each of those. If you're positive that some of this stuff does not apply to you, then you can skip that section. But everything that we talked about a second ago, all of this stuff on this slide, and I would say probably all of this stuff too, you should watch, because this stuff and this stuff is really common. These kinds of questions get asked in almost every case. These, though, it will depend on the facts of your case and what your case is about. Okay. So just let me say a couple words of introduction. This stuff, these questions that we're about to cover, happen in the introduction of an asylum interview. So at the asylum office, there's like 3 sort of distinct phases. And one of them is the introduction phase, or kind of the administrative phase, where the officer goes over some ground rules with you and just asks you a few introductory questions to get started before you get into the real substantive questions about your case. And so these questions that we're about to cover are some of those, and you will get some of these in immigration court as well. So the officer they like to ask this question, something like, how are you feeling today? Or how are you doing? How's it going? And then they'll ask, is there anything going on that may affect your ability to understand or answer my questions today? Now, why are they asking these questions like, hey, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And this one about, is there anything going on that may affect your ability to understand my questions? Well, they want to get you to say, oh no, everything's good. I'm fine. Nope, I'm great. So that later you cannot say, oh, well, please reconsider the negative decision in my case. It wasn't fair because I was sick that day and I was having trouble concentrating because I was sick and I had a fever and I couldn't think straight. They basically are trying to take away your excuses with questions like these. And they may ask something like, has a medical professional ever diagnosed you with memory problems? Same idea here, because sometimes people will say, oh, well, I just have a bad memory, or maybe I have a sort of a medical memory problem where I can't remember certain things, maybe due to trauma or any other reason. And that could be a reason why someone might not be able to remember things that the officer is asking them to talk about. And they don't want you to use this as an excuse, like, oh, I had this issue with memory that I couldn't recall the things you were asking me about. They want you to say, oh, no, I'm fine. My memory's fine with questions like this, okay? Are you able to understand the interpreter? They don't want you to later be able to say, oh, well, it was a problem of communication. I just couldn't understand the interpreter very well, assuming that you are, in fact, using an interpreter. And if you're not using an interpreter, they may ask you, can you understand me? If English is not your first language, they'll say, okay, are you sure you're able to understand me well today? And are you comfortable communicating in English? Do you feel like you're fluent enough in English to keep doing this interview in English? All right. Why did you decide to move to wherever you're living, like the city and state where you currently live? Why are they asking you this? Because sometimes people do what's called forum shopping, where they will just pick an asylum office with a higher approval rate than the one that they should be going to. And they'll say, oh, I live in San Francisco. So usually San Francisco has the highest approval rate. And so someone might just make up an address or use the address of a friend or someone else in San Francisco, even though they really live in Houston. And the Houston Asylum Office has a lower approval rate than San Francisco. So people will do this sort of thing and basically lie about where they live to get a more friendly asylum office. And so the officer will sometimes ask questions about this, like, oh, tell me, why did you decide to move there? And they'll ask follow-up questions too, to see if you can answer in a convincing way to show them that, yeah, no, I really do live here. Okay. When and how did you find out about the asylum process? When did you apply for asylum? Now they have this in their records, but they ask you this anyways. Did anyone help you prepare your asylum application? You're going to get lots of questions about how your application got prepared, because at the asylum office, especially, the officers are really, really uptight about this. They think that there's fraud in just about every application, and they want to know how you did your application. Did you pay someone to do it for you? Did someone help you? Was that person some shady form preparer or so-called notario? And they seem really incentivized to try to uncover fraud in the application process. So you'll probably get a lot of questions about how you went about preparing your asylum application. So, if someone did help you, like, how did you find that person? How did you learn about them? And what exactly did they do to help you prepare it? And so you need to be able to say exactly what they did to help you. When did you meet your attorney? This is if you have a lawyer. Along the same lines, there's actually a lot of really shady, unethical, unprofessional lawyers out there that commit fraud. And so asylum officers are always on the lookout to try to look out for these shady lawyers. Okay, how did you find your attorney? And do you want to have your attorney present at your interview today? They'll say that even if your lawyer's in the room, they'll want to confirm that you want your lawyer to be there with you. All right, did your attorney help you prepare your asylum application? And what specifically did your attorney do to help with your asylum application? Does your attorney speak your native language? Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes the attorney does not speak the applicant's language. And so if they don't, the officer will ask follow-up questions like, well, then how did you communicate? And basically trying to figure out how you were able to manage working together if you don't speak the same language, because it could be a fraud indicator. This one's important. Did someone read back to you in your native language all the information that's provided in your asylum application before it was submitted? Basically, do you know what's in your asylum application? And if you're not a native English speaker, even though you're fluent in English, if you're not a native English speaker, if it's not your first language, they want to ensure that you know what was in your application and that you understood the questions being asked, okay? And so if it's not your first language, they want to know, well, did someone read it to you, like the questions and your answers to those questions in your language, okay, before you actually submitted it? And then along those lines, when they read back the information to you in your native language, was there any incorrect or missing information? Also, are you confident now that the information in your application is true and correct? Are there any changes that you know of right now that we need to make to your application? And the officer is going to go through almost every question in your application with you, and you can make changes at that as you come to anything that needs to be changed, to be updated or corrected. But they also usually ask this question before they go through everything with you and say, oh, is there anything that you already know of right now that needs to be changed to make it accurate? When was the last time you reviewed your application? Did anyone help you prepare your personal statement that you submitted with your application materials? Most asylum applicants submit a personal statement or declaration in which they explain their case, explain their story in written format. And so the asylum officers ask a lot of questions about this, about how did you do it? Because people do commit fraud in this way. People will often just buy a personal statement from somebody off of WhatsApp or whatever, or have a friend or someone else write a statement for them that is not true. It's not their real facts of their case. So you may get a lot of questions about how you did your personal statement. If someone helped you, who helped you? And what did they do exactly to help you? And did you look at any sample declarations or like any models or templates of declarations before you did your own statement? Like, did you look at a sample, online or whatever, or from someone else that that already applied for asylum? Did you write the personal statement on your own? Is it written in your own words? Did anyone suggest edits to your personal statement? Is all the information in your personal statement true and correct? And did you ever apply to extend or change the status that you had when you entered the United States? Why are they asking about your status? Because for people who came on a visa, well, for anyone, your status at the time of a negative asylum decision from the asylum office matters for what happens next in your case. And so the officers, they actually don't always know your status, even though they have records related to your immigration history. Sometimes it's still hard to determine whether you currently have valid status. And so they want to know, okay, like let's say you came on a tourist visa or a student visa and that was set to expire at a certain time. Well, did you ever apply to extend or change that status? Okay. And they want to know, what's the highest level of education that you completed? Why are they asking questions like this? And also like this one, what job did you do in your home country? Why do they care about that sort of thing? They want to gauge your level of sophistication. They want to know if you're well educated and whether you had like a professional versus a blue collar type of job, because they want to get sort of a sense for your level of sophistication, because that will determine to some extent the questions they ask you and how they ask them and how they deal with you. Because if if it's someone who is not educated at all, like they didn't finish, elementary school, and they are a construction worker in their home country, then, it's going to be a little bit different than dealing with someone who has a PhD and is a professor of economics or something. Do you have any other documents that you want to provide me today that have not already been submitted? You'll probably get this question when you check in at the asylum office, like right when you get inside of security and you go to check in, the little check-in kiosk. They usually ask you this question there, but then often you get it again from the asylum officer during the interview. Okay, about whether you have anything else that you want the officer to consider in terms of like evidence for your case. All right, so those are the introductory questions. Now we're going to go on to questions that you get during the review of your asylum application and some other stuff that they'll discuss with you. Because after they shoot the breeze a little bit and do some, hey, how's it going? How was the drive in here? Then they go into those introductory questions we just covered. And then they do the asylum application review, where they literally take out the asylum application that you submitted and they go almost question by question. Not every single question, but most of them, they're going to go over with you to see if anything needs to be changed or corrected, updated, or changed for any reason. So questions that you're going to get are basically the questions from the asylum application form. Like, what is your full name? Have you ever used another name, including a maiden name or a nickname? Pay attention to this, because often people don't really think carefully about this when they submit their asylum application, but they should have included that, they should have said, yes, I had a different name before I got married. My last name was different. Or, maybe a identification card that you have for your country, or a school ID card or something shows your name in a different way than what's on your passport. Well, then you need to answer yes to this question and tell them about it. You're not going to get in trouble for not having put that on your application form. They're just going to update it. Okay. And by the way, I say this in all my trainings, so hopefully you've attended some of those and heard me say this. Tell the truth. Okay. Honesty is the best policy, both because it's the right thing to do generally. And then, not generally, but just as a general matter, it is the right thing to do. It's always the right thing to do. But also strategically, it's just better for your case and your chances for asylum success if you tell the truth, okay? Right, moving along. What is your date of birth? In what city and country were you born? Are you a citizen of, this should be your country of origin, the one that you listed on the asylum application form. Have you ever had citizenship or any other long-term legal status in any other country than the one of which you're a citizen? And what is your race? This one can be actually a little confusing because in some cultures, they don't really have this idea, or at least this understanding of race that we have in the United States. So don't worry if this seems like a weird question to you. It doesn't really matter. You can say whatever you want, whether you consider yourself to be, Latino, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, whatever. It doesn't really matter. There's no right or wrong answer. You can say any of those, whatever you consider yourself to be, and that'll be fine. All right. Are you religious? And if so, what is your religion? What is your current address? Can you receive mail at this address? Because sometimes people live at a place where they cannot reliably receive mail, and so they'll have a different address for that purpose, for getting mail. In what month and year did you begin living at this address? And what was your last address in your own country? So where did you live last in your own country, in your home country? On what date did you last leave your country? On what date did you most recently enter the United States? And sometimes they have records of this, sometimes they don't. But this is relevant for purposes of the 1-year filing deadline because the officer wants to ensure that you applied during your first year in the United States. What was your legal status when you most recently entered the United States? So like what kind of visa did you have? Okay. How many times total have you entered the United States? This is sometimes problematic because sometimes people have entered a lot of times and they don't really remember whether it was, 4 or 5 or 8 times or whatever. So before your interview, you should try to actually figure out every time you've entered the United States, like know how many times it was. And if it's only a handful or a few, do try to memorize the dates, okay? And the location, like what city did you fly into? Okay. And to which countries other than the United States have you traveled in your entire life? Sometimes this question comes at this stage of the interview, kind of in the asylum application review. Sometimes it's closer to the end, but you'll probably get this question. You almost certainly will get this question. So like, what other countries have you been in? And then usually the follow-up question is, okay, for any countries you listed, why did you travel to those countries? What was your purpose? Basically, they're trying to see if you have some kind of suspicious travel history, like if you went to some country where there was a civil war going on or any kind of war during the time that you were there, and you were there for 6 months and you can't really explain why you went there, they may think, oh, you were going to fight in this war. So that's why they ask these kinds of questions usually. It may also be relevant for purposes of the firm resettlement bar, which we touched on earlier and we'll get to in more detail later. All right, what are your parents' names? In what city and country do your parents live? How many siblings do you have? What are the names of your siblings? Where do your siblings live? Which, and by that they want to know usually the city and the country, all right? Which elementary school and middle school and high school did you attend? For each of these institutions, in what month and year did you begin studying there? And in what month and year did you finish? All right, did you attend university? And if so, what's the name of it? In what month and year did you begin studying there? And in what month and year did you finish? I got to say, these questions about your addresses and the schools that you attended are kind of annoying because people don't usually remember this kind of information off the top of their head. So you should have included the details about this in your asylum application, but most people don't, especially for their whole life. Usually they'll just put the university they went to and not the high school and elementary school. But the officer does need to put that information into the asylum application, like the final version of it that you will agree on at the interview. So you do need to figure that out if you don't already have it in the application form. You need to know every school that you've attended and the month and year in which you started attending and the month and year in which you stopped attending for each of those schools, okay? What did you study at university? Like what subject or what was your major? Did you graduate with a degree from university? What is your native language? Native language means basically it means the language that you spoke growing up, like at home as your first language. And actually you can have multiple native languages or multiple first languages. If you, for example, if you spoke one language at home with your family, but in all of your schooling and all of your interactions outside of the house were in another language, and so you're totally fluent in both languages, it's fine to say that you had two. Just tell the officer that. Do you speak other languages fluently? And if so, which languages? This is tough because, it's fluency is an objective thing. But if you feel like you're pretty good at a language, then you could say, yeah, I think I'm decent. I'm fairly fluent at so-and-so language. Are you married? Have you ever been married before? If you're currently married, when did you get married? What date? And what's your spouse's full name? Next, do you want your spouse to be included as a dependent in your asylum claim? They'll ask you this even if you check the box on the application form that says, yes, I want this person to be a dependent in my claim, okay? Either way, they'll ask you this question. Do you have children? And if so, how many children do you have? And what are their names? And what are their dates of birth? When were they born? Do you want your children to be included as dependents in your asylum claim? And by the way, to be a dependent means that if you win asylum, they will get asylee status as well. They get it through you. So most people do want their spouse and children to be included as dependents in their asylum claim so they can get that status. The risk or downside to including them as a dependent is that if you get denied, if the asylum officer says, no, you're not eligible for asylum, and you get sent to immigration court for deportation proceedings, your family members whom you included as dependents in your case will also get sent to immigration court if they don't have legal status. So that's kind of the risk. But if you say, no, I don't want him to be a dependent in my case, then they almost certainly will not get sent to immigration court, even if you get a negative decision from the asylum office. All right. Did your spouse and children enter the United States with you at the same time in the same place and with the same immigration status? Have you or the dependents in your claim ever gotten a letter that says you need to go to immigration court because the government has placed you in deportation proceedings? If that's happened, like if you've been in immigration court, then your case cannot be heard by the asylum office. Instead, it should be with the immigration court. And you should not be having the interview with the asylum office. Like it should not be scheduled if you're in deportation proceedings, but it happens sometimes just because of communications mix-ups in the government. So that's why they're asking about this. If you've been in immigration court or gotten a letter that says, hey, you need to go to immigration court, the officer at the asylum interview will probably stop the interview and investigate to try to figure out what's going on. All right. Have you ever lied or in any way misrepresented anything to a U.S. immigration officer, whether in writing or orally? Let me comment more on this. This is kind of a trick question because you may be thinking, oh no, I'm telling the truth. My case is real. I've told the truth always. I'm always going to tell the truth about it. What trips people up is that many people lie or misrepresent or conceal something to get their visa to come to the United States. Like they'll say, oh, I just want to go for tourist purposes. I'm going to Disneyland or I'm going to see family, something like that. When in reality, they intend to come and apply for asylum and try to stay permanently. So that is a misrepresentation. That's a lie. If you did that, you need to answer this question in the affirmative. You need to say yes, and you need to explain what happened. It will be forgiven. It will not keep you from getting asylum. But if you say, no, never, officer, never, the officer at your asylum interview might confront you with the records from your visa interview. They have the notes that the officer took at your visa interview abroad. And if it says, well, it says here, and you put in your application form that you were coming for tourism, but you told me earlier, maybe you did, that, you knew well before then that you wanted to flee your country and apply for asylum in the United States. So you lied at the visa interview. And today you told me you'd never lied to a U.S. immigration officer, but I see that you have. So what you told me today was another lie. That can hurt your case. Okay. That can actually keep you from getting asylum. But being honest about having misrepresented yourself to flee your country will not keep you from getting asylum. All right. So let's get to the section of past harm. Almost always in the asylum interview, after this introductory stuff and the asylum application form review, the officer turns to this, to looking toward the past to try to see whether you have suffered harm that is sufficiently severe to rise to the level of persecution. What is persecution? Well, persecution in the way that it's used under U.S. asylum law basically means really serious harm. Have you been harmed gravely in a really serious way? And the officer will start by looking at what's already happened to you and saying, okay, have you been harmed? Whether physically or psychological harm can count as well. So they want to know, have you been harmed physically or psychologically? And if so, in what way, so that they can assess whether that harm is bad enough to rise to the level of persecution. Okay, so that's what this section is all about. So they're going to ask things like, have you ever been physically harmed in your country? Like, has your body ever been touched in a way that was harmful to you, whether by another, human, or by getting shot or getting hit with a bat or getting shoved to the ground? Anything that has physically harmed your body is what they're asking you about with this question. And then if so, how many times in total have you been physically harmed? Like, how many separate incidents of harm have there been? Asylum officers always ask these two questions. So you need to know ahead of time before your asylum interview, you need to think back on, okay, how many times have I been physically harmed and how many times have I been threatened? And it may be hard to count. You may not remember that well, but you need to do your best to at least give an estimate. Something like, well, there were 3 incidents where my body was physically harmed, and there was this other time where they put a gun to my head and told me they were going to kill me, and I thought they were going to kill me, and that was very devastating and very hard on me, but they didn't physically harm my body on that occasion. That's a way that you could explain to the officer one of these situations that it's not really clear whether that 4th incident counts as physical harm or not, whether it's responsive to this question. But do think about this stuff ahead of time. It's really important. Okay. What do you think it is that motivated them to harm you, and what makes you think this? Now, this kind of question gets at nexus, which I said earlier is this requirement that the persecution be on account of or motivated by the fact that you possess one of the 5 protected characteristics. So the officer, sometimes they'll ask a bunch of questions in a row during a certain time in the interview about this issue, like asking questions to figure out, okay, what's motivating them. But they will also sort of intersperse or sprinkle in these kinds of questions around each incident of harm or each threat or anything that has happened that is relevant that might show the officer what the bad guys are thinking, like what their motivation is, okay? And they may just ask you your opinion on it. Like in this question that we see here, number 79, we have, what do you think it is that motivated them to harm you, and what makes you think this? If you just say, oh, I think it's my religion, the next question is going to be why, or what makes you think that? So you have to be able to point to concrete things that have happened, like things that the bad guy said, or some kind of circumstance that shows, okay, that's probably what the reason was. Okay. Because that's what the officer needs to know. And when was the first time you were harmed? Try to be able to give the date. For any question like this about when did something happen, you need to think ahead of time before your interview and see if you can get the actual date. All right. And memorize that. If not, try to give at least the month and year. If you can't do that, try to give at least the year and the time of year. Like, for example, I'm not really sure when it was, officer. I think it was, around the spring of 2015. I think it was spring because I remember that, the flowers were just beginning to bloom around that time when this thing happened. So that makes me think it was spring. Any kind of context that helps you to place the timing of the incident can be helpful for you to relay to the officer if you're not certain about the time. All right, when was the last time you were harmed? So the other question before was, when was the first time? And this next one, 81, is when was the last time? Officers very, very often want to know the first time and last time. If you've been harmed many times, they at least want to know what the dates were for these two. They might not discuss with you every incident of harm, but they usually will discuss with you the first one and the last one, and then also the worst one. So you'll get this question very often. When was the worst episode of harm you suffered? Because if you've been harmed 20 times, the officer is not going to talk to you about all 20 of those in detail. They just don't have time for that. So they're going to ask you, this is called the first, last, and worst framework. When was the first time? When was the last time? And what was the worst incident? Because this usually gives them enough information to really understand what's going on and the severity of the harm. By when was the worst episode of harm, they mean like what was the scariest thing or the time where they hurt your body the most. Okay, like when did they really do the most damage to you? So think about that ahead of time. Who harmed you? The identity of the persecutor is very important. So you need to be able to say who it was. If you know their name, that's great. If you don't know their name, but you know that they were members of the National Guard, then you should say that. And, you're going to get asked questions like, well, how do you know that? Or what makes you think they were from the National Guard? Well, they had, the National Guard uniform that you see all over the place. Or they showed me their badge or whatever. Okay. 84, how many attackers were there? In an incident of harm, the officer will always ask this. How many were there? Okay. If you know, say it. If you don't, give an estimate. Like, I don't know. It all happened so fast. There was a bunch of them. I think there was probably at least 8, probably between 8 and 12. That's perfectly fine. Okay. What were they wearing? What were you doing when they approached you? The officer wants to sort of understand the context. They want to be able to see in their mind the scene unfold. And these kinds of questions help provide that. And they may be helpful also for assessing both the severity of harm, like is it bad enough to count as persecution? And also little details like this may prompt you to give information that also tells them about the nexus, about the motivation. So, in this instance of what were you doing when they approached you? Well, if you were at a protest against the government and you had a sign up the sign you were holding up that said the government is the worst, this political party in power is terrible, and their policies are ruining our country, down with this party. If that's what you were doing when you got attacked, that's relevant. There's a pretty good chance that the persecution is on account of your political opinion. It's circumstantial evidence, but it's relevant. Okay. Where were you when they approached you? So what were you doing? And then 87, where were you? Like, were you standing on, the sidewalk? Were you in the middle of the street? Were you in your living room at your house? Where were you? What did they say to you when they first approached you before harming you? You're going to get questions like this many times at your asylum interview. What did they say? What did they say? What did they say? What else did they say? Why does the officer ask questions like this over and over? Because their words may give away their intentions and, their motivations. They may give away their intentions too about future harm, but they're also relevant because of the motivation. Because sometimes they'll say straight up, there may be some racist thing they say to you, or they may say, you guys from this certain political party, you're the worst. How dare you challenge our party? We're going to get you. Well, that shows that it's political opinion, right? It's not always that explicit. It may just be something that sort of you have to infer what the motivation is, but it can still be helpful. So you will get questions like, what did they say? What else did they say? Did they say anything else? You'll get a lot of questions like that. What did they say to you while they were attacking you? So like before they attacked you, while they were attacking you, and after the attack or after the incident. What did they say to you after the incident? What did they do to harm your body exactly? Now, you can't just say they beat me, okay? That's meaningless. It does not help the officer to understand how severe the harm was, okay? Don't say they beat me. Describe the actual things that they did to you. For example, if you got attacked by 3 guys who were carrying baseball bats and hit you with them, you would want to describe in detail something like, the 3 guys approached me, all 3 of them had baseball bats, and one of them came at me and he hit me on my left arm very hard with a baseball bat, and I fell down. When I fell down, the other 2 started kicking me. They kicked me several times each, several times in my stomach and on my back. And then the first guy who had originally hit me with the bat came over and kicked me once in the face, and then he reached back and swung his bat and hit me in the back of the head, and that's the last thing I remember because I went unconscious after that. Okay, that would be a description of what they did to harm your body. Not just, oh, they hit me or they attacked me or they beat me. All right? It's very important that you describe in detail the incidents so the officer can see just how bad the harm was. What did they hit you with? If you say they hit me, the officer wants to know with what? Like with their closed fist in a punch, or with a hard wooden object or a sharp object? What did they hit you with? Where on your body did they hit you? Okay? Stomach, back, legs, head. You need to tell the officer where. And also, how many times did they hit you? Okay, so the example that I gave a second ago addressed all of these little questions about how many times, where in your body, things like that. Okay, how long did the attack last? You probably won't remember exactly, but you may have an estimate that's something like, oh, it was very quick. It was probably just like a minute or 2, or it may be like, oh, it lasted a long time. It felt like 20 minutes, but it was probably more like 5 minutes, I would estimate. Okay. How did the attack end? Like, were the attackers chased off, or did they just get tired and stop, or what? Like, what was it that made them stop attacking you? Did they do anything to make you think they were going to kill you right then and there? Why is this relevant? Because severe psychological harm can count as persecution, okay? Or also it can count as persecution by itself, but more commonly, it's one of the different things that the officer will consider in combination with other things like physical harm, so that they can say, okay, if I consider all of these incidents of harm cumulatively, like meaning basically add them all up, like, okay, add it up, considered together, the different things that have happened to this person are severe enough to count as persecution. And there's case law where judges have said, okay, if someone gets put at objective, reasonable fear of imminent death, that can be bad enough to be considered persecution. So like if someone does a mock execution where they put a gun to your head and they pull the trigger, they say, we're going to kill you now. And they you're on your knees and they pull the trigger, but it doesn't fire because it's like a blank and they're just messing with you. That's a mock execution. And if you thought they were going to kill you right then and there, and that caused you a lot of psychological harm, that could be persecution, okay? All right, 98, were the attackers armed? And if so, with what kind of weapon? Did they point a gun at you? And if so, how far away were they when they pointed the gun at you? How old were you when the incident of harm occurred? This is important because if you are a minor, like if you're under 18, then any incident of harm is considered to be inherently more grave. Like basically the idea is that children are affected in a more profound way than adults by like the same act of harm, the same incident. So if you're a child, it's like a thing that might seem like not that big of a deal to an adult is considered to be a bigger deal when it happens to someone who's younger. Okay. Were other people harmed at the same time as you? And if so, who were they and what happened to them? Like how were they harmed? And were you injured in the incident? Okay. So you're going to get this question, even if you say, yeah, I was attacked with a baseball bat by 3 people, the officer still wants to know about the actual injuries that you suffered. Okay. Like did you have broken bones? Did you have bruises all over your arms? Did you dislocate your hip when you got shoved down and have trouble walking for 3 weeks afterwards? Okay, what were your actual injuries? Same idea. What exactly were your injuries? Like, be able to describe them, okay? Did you seek medical treatment for your injuries? Because this, if you had to go to the hospital or the doctor, it helps to show, look, yeah, it was pretty serious. It must have been a big deal. It must have been really grave. If you did not seek medical attention, but you were injured, like, why not? If you went to the hospital or to see a doctor, what did they do? Like, what treatment did they provide for you? How long were you in the hospital? Because if you were injured so severely that you had to stay in the hospital for 3 weeks and you had to have like surgery and you were there for 3 weeks, that's a big deal. That shows us, wow, that harm is really bad. And just the mere fact of having to stay in the hospital for so long is bad. So it's a form of harm, really, that the persecutors caused you to be subjected to. Do you have records from when you sought medical attention, like a doctor's note or receipts for payment for services? For how long were you in pain after the incident? Like if your injuries kept you from performing daily tasks or maybe kept you from doing your job at work, that's relevant. So you need to tell the officer about that. They're going to ask you a question like this. Did your injuries make it hard to carry out routine tasks or perform your job? Just talked about that. Do your injuries continue to affect you to this day? And if so, in what way? So this is the question of enduring harm. Like if something is still causing problems for you, whether it's a physical problem to your body or a psychological harm, then that's relevant. And that helps show that the harm is severe enough to count as persecution. Okay. What did you do immediately after the attack? Were you alone or was someone with you when you were assaulted? Like were you with a friend or a family member? Were there witnesses? Did you report the incident to the authorities? This is really important, especially when the attacker is not a government actor. Rather, it's a private, normal civilian, and they attack you because to win asylum, where the persecutor is a private actor, you have to show that the government is unable or unwilling to control the persecutors. So part of that analysis is, okay, well, did the victim,
go and report the incident to the authorities and at least try to let the authorities help you. Okay. And if you did, well, what did they do? Did they do an investigation, or what steps did they take, as far as you know, to try to help you? Because if you go and report and they just say, sorry, not our problem, then that helps to show that they are unable or unwilling to help you. Okay. And then did you reach out to the authorities to follow up with them if you didn't hear from them shortly after you made the report? So basically, like, you made the report and they're like, yeah, we'll look into it. Well, did you follow up like a week or 2 or 3 or a month later and say, hey, where does the investigation stand? What's been done? Are you doing anything to investigate or to bring these perpetrators to justice or to help me, to make me safe? Okay. How do you know that they did not investigate your case? This is relevant where, as in most asylum cases, the applicant says, oh, I reported it to them, but they didn't do anything. They didn't take it seriously. The officer will say, how do you know that? Or what makes you think they didn't investigate it or take any action to help you? Like, what can you point to that shows us that that's true? All right. A little more on this issue of enduring harm, meaning harm that lasts for a long time, including possibly up to the present, which is relevant for establishing that the harm that you suffered in the past counts as persecution. So how has what you've been through in your country affected you? And to answer this question, you can talk about any physical harm that you still have, pain or that you still have, or psychological, like, whether you have maybe you have nightmares or trouble sleeping or panic attacks when you see police, or anything at all that is unpleasant or bad or harmful for you that you're experiencing that you think is related to what you went through in your country. This is the time to bring it up. Okay. Do you continue to struggle mentally or emotionally from the trauma you endured? Do you have nightmares, insomnia, feel afraid, or have other such problems because of what you've been through? Have you ever sought help from any mental health provider to help deal with the trauma from what you've been through? So like, have you seen a psychologist, a therapist, a psychiatrist, or like a normal doctor, like a general practitioner, to talk to them about what you've been through? Very often people will be seeing like a counselor or a therapist because they're depressed or because they have a lot of like post-traumatic secondary stress disorder or some kind of, some kind of challenges that they're going through because of what happened in their country. If you are seeing someone for that, it's important that the officer know this, because it does help to show that the harm is really bad. And ideally, you should get a letter from them talking about this and use it as evidence. So if you're not, if you went through something really bad and you are having problems, but you're not seeing a mental health professional to get help, or never have seen one, like, if not, why not? If you have, during what time frame did you see them, and how often did you see them? Has a medical health professional diagnosed you with depression or prescribed medication for you to help you handle the trauma caused by what you endured? All right, moving on, we're going to talk about the future. So the officer now has looked at the past harm and decided, probably by now in their own mind, whether what you've been through counts as past persecution or not. And now they're going to look toward the future. And the question is, okay, is the person still at risk? Because usually to win asylum, you do have to still be afraid of being harmed in the future or persecuted in the future on account of protected ground. There's a couple of exceptions where you can win asylum based just on past harm alone. But in most cases, you have to show that you're at risk in the future. Okay. So that's what this section of the interview is about. So threats that you've received, or really anything else, any circumstances that lead the officer to believe that, yeah, you're at risk in the future. Okay. So they often want to ask about what the thing was that caused you to leave your country, because that often is something that is severe enough or significant enough to show that the bad guys are very serious about wanting to harm you in the future. So what was it that caused you to decide definitively to leave your country? Next, have you been threatened in your country? So we talked previously about incidents of past harm. Sometimes people don't have that, right? There's lots of people who actually go on to win asylum that have never been harmed in their country. And so the case really starts for them with the questions to sort of get to the heart of the case in the interview are going to focus on, okay, well, what makes us think that you're going to be harmed in the future? And one thing that can show us that is threats in the past. Like someone saying they want to kill you or going to kill you is a threat that indicates that, yeah, you are at risk of being harmed in the future. So have you been threatened? Who threatened you? What did they say exactly? And you want to try to quote them, okay? You don't want to say, oh, they threatened me. Well, that doesn't tell us much. Like we want to know what they actually said, okay? To the extent that you can remember. You don't have to quote them verbatim, but if you remember that they said something along the lines of, you scumbag, political party X member, you're the worst. We're going to get you. Like you need to try to summarize that or try to repeat that, but you can add a caveat to say something like, well, you know what, officer, I don't remember the exact words they used, but it was something very close to, and repeat, what you remember. All right. When were you threatened? Again, as with all date related questions, if you remember the date, that's great. If not, try the month and the year. If not, try at least the time of year and the year. When were you threatened? This goes for this goes for all threats. And then in the same way we talked about the first, last, and worst incidents of physical harm in the past, the officer often will ask you, when was the first time you were threatened? Okay. And then when was the last time you were threatened? When were you threatened for the last time? How many times in total have you been threatened? And how were the threats passed along to you? Was it in person, by phone, like in a written note through another person, or what? Like, how did you learn about the threat? Do you have records of these threats, like text messages, maybe a photo of graffiti on the wall or anything like that? Did you report the threats to the authorities? If not, why not? If you did report the threats to the authorities, what did they say and do in response? When you reported the threat to the police, did you bring your phone with you to have it checked by the police? Like, so for example, if this is assuming that you had like threatening text messages, like did the police actually see those threats on your phone? And did the number that the threats came from, did it actually show up on your phone screen, or was it like blocked or masked or hidden? What made you feel that you were being watched or followed? This is for cases where the person says, oh, they started following me. People will often say that, but not be able to point to anything concrete or really explain what they mean. So if you say, oh yeah, then they started following me, the officer's like, well, what do you mean by that? What made you think that they were watching you or following you? And so if you saw, I saw 3 men, in wearing the clothing that this religious extremist group usually wears. I saw them sitting outside my house on their motorcycles, every night for several hours, just looking towards my house. So that makes me think they were watching me. You need to be able to point to what it is that makes you think that, okay? What led you believe that those people planned to harm you? Have you received any summons or been charged with any crime? This isn't relevant where the government is targeting someone. If the police or other legal authorities have actually charged you with a crime or sent you a letter that says you need to appear for questioning or come to the police office or something like that, that's very relevant. It shows that, yeah, they're serious about harming you. You may be harmed in the future. So why did they summon you? Often this will be the prosecutor's office. Sometimes it's the police, but if you know why they summoned you and told you to come in, did the letter that they sent explain why? And if not, why do you think they did so? Or what do you think is the real reason that they did so? Did you appear as you were requested to do in the summons? Did you show up? And if so, what happened when you showed up? What did they say and do? And if you did not go, why not? Did the authorities follow up with you after the first summons? Did they send another summons, or did they send someone to your house maybe or to your neighbors or your parents' house to say, hey, Jane was supposed to come to the police station. She never did. Tell her that if she doesn't come tomorrow, she's going to be in real trouble. Do you have any reason to believe that a warrant for your arrest exists? Do you think the police have issued a warrant to arrest you? If so, what makes you think this? What are the charges against you, and what punishment is possible if you're convicted of those crimes that you're being charged with? Could there be any legitimate basis at all for the charges against you or for any investigation into your activities? Basically, is there even arguably a legitimate, real good reason for the police or the authorities to be interested in you? Have you done something that could be considered a crime. Because if you're going to be, let's say, arrested and put in jail long term, well, it would be persecution if it's unjust, if there's no reason to do it. And really they're just doing it, because they don't like your race or your tribe. That would be illegal or persecution under the U.S. asylum laws. But if you committed a crime and their laws are, somewhat fair and they put you in jail long-term under the laws in accordance with the law, then that would be called prosecution and not persecution, and you wouldn't win asylum. All right. The things that happened in your country all occurred a long time ago. What makes you think that someone still wants to harm you after all this time? This is very common. And it happens a lot for people that have been waiting for years to get their asylum application. By the way, to get their asylum interview, not their application. If you've been waiting more than 3 years to get your interview after applying, we should talk. You should call us because we may be able to get your interview by suing the government or threatening to sue them, okay? But the officer will often say, look, that was a long time ago. I understand that bad things happened and that they were interested in you back then, but that was a long time ago. Why would they even remember you? Why would they even be thinking about you now? So what can you point to show me that, yeah, no, you're still at risk. These people still want to harm you even after all this time. This is a very important point. You need to think very carefully about this. Is there anything that you can point to that will help convince the officer that, yeah, no, you're still at risk? Okay. Has anything happened since you've been in the United States that makes you think these people still want to harm you? For example, this is an example of that. Has someone gone to your neighbors or family members in your country and asked about you? Like, hey, when is Bill coming back? We heard he's abroad. Tell him to come give us a call or a visit when he comes back. So if that happened, who came and when, and what did they want or what did they say? How many times did they come? Have you received threats since you've been in the United States? Sometimes in addition to going to talk to your family or neighbors, you might get direct threats through social media or a phone call or even delivered from someone else in the United States. What exactly do you fear will happen to you if you have to return to your country? Okay, being beaten is not specific enough. Be very specific about what you think will happen to you and who will do it. Who exactly in your country do you fear will harm you? Be as specific as possible, okay? Why do you think it is that the people you fear haven't already done something really bad to you? So for example, why didn't they make good on their threats to kill or imprison you while you were still in your country? This is kind of a stupid line of questioning, but it's very common. The idea is, well, yeah, these bad guys, they threatened to kill you, but they didn't go through with it. So they must not be serious. So if they didn't do it already, what makes you think they might do it in the future? Because they showed us they're not serious because they didn't follow through. It's kind of dumb reasoning, but you may get this, very well may get a question like this. All right. So after your problems began, did you make efforts to lay low, so as to avoid contact with the people you fear? If so, how did you do this exactly? And did you leave your country through a formal exit point, such as by flying out of an international airport or crossing an official land border? The idea here is that if you did, you probably went through some kind of immigration checkpoint or protocol at the airport. And if the country that you're fleeing really wanted to harm you, then why didn't they arrest you when you were in contact with them? And they probably, if they were after you, they probably would have your name flagged in a database, and that should have come up when you went through immigration. So why did they let you leave? Why didn't they arrest you then? That's the idea. And it's questions like this by way of follow-up. If so, did you go through immigration control? And if so, why didn't they arrest you or do anything bad to you, and instead just let you leave the country? If you went back to your country, how would the people you fear even know that you had returned? How would they find out that you're there? Do you fear anybody else will harm you besides the people you've already mentioned? And next, we're going to talk about this nexus requirement, the connection to a protected ground, which again, the protected grounds are your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and something called membership in a particular social group. So what do you believe it is that caused the persecutors to harm or threaten you? What makes you think this? What did they say to you that may indicate their motive in singling you out for harm? In other words, did they use any words that show why it is that they came after you in particular, and why not some other guy who's similarly situated to you? Why you? Okay. What leads you to believe that what happened to you wasn't simply a random occurrence? What makes you think that they harmed you because of your whatever the protected ground is that you've listed on your application? They may ask you specifically, okay, so what makes you think that the harm or the targeting of you is because of this ground? Are you aware of other people who have been harmed by the same people you fear? And if so, what was it that caused the persecutors to harm those people? Do you have any close friends or family members who have been harmed or threatened over whatever it is that leads you to believe that the persecutors will want to harm you? The idea is if you have friends, family, people who are like you in ways relevant to an asylum claim, and these people have been harmed, well then yeah, they may well likely harm you too. Okay. Are there any other facts or circumstances that can help me understand why it is that the persecutors will want to target you personally for harm in the future? All right. Misspelling, it should say private actors as persecutors. Again, this is where it's not the government that's doing the persecuting, but people who don't work for the government. So are you afraid of someone in your country that is not working for the government? And do you believe the people you fear have any kind of ties to or are supported by the government? Because remember, you have to show in these cases that the government's unable or unwilling to protect you. Let's say that you're being persecuted not by the police, but originally by someone who's not the police, like some gang, or some religious extremist group, let's say, because of your religion. And they have people in the police that they pay, that they bribe. Well, that's relevant because then you're reasonable in saying, no, I can't go to the police. The police are bought off by these guys. And here's how I know this. That would help you in your case. Okay. All right. So what makes you think this? Have you ever seen the people that you fear and the police or anyone else from the government together? Like if you've seen them literally hanging out together, doing drugs together, or just even hanging out together, that could show that, they're in tight with the bad guys who are private actors are in tight with the police. Therefore, the police might not help you. Do you know of anyone who has reported the people you fear to the police? So has someone else gone to the police to report the people that you fear? And if so, what happened? Did the authorities arrest and charge the people? And were they convicted of a crime? Did they go to jail? And if so, for how long? Do you have any reason to believe that the government would turn a blind eye if you reported the people that you fear? And if so, why? Or what makes you think this? What would cause the authorities to ignore a complaint against the people that you fear? Like, why would they do this? If you went to them and you're telling me, no, the police won't help me. Why? What would cause them to be like that? Do you believe the government is simply overmatched by the persecutors such that it's unable to protect people like you? Remember, it's not just a matter of unwilling to protect you. You can also win asylum in the face of persecution by private actors where the government is unable to protect you. So if the government just cannot control this, let's say, terrorist group, because the terrorist group has more members and more resources and more weapons than the police in your country, and the police are scared of them and they're just overmatched and outgunned, that's relevant to your case, okay? And if so, what makes you think this? All right, and then they get to the sort of the end or wrap-up portion of the substantive answers or substantive questions in the asylum case. They'll ask things like, have you understood all my questions today? Because they don't want you to later be able to say, oh, I misunderstood. I didn't understand you. So can we do the interview again? They're trying to preempt or foreclose that from happening. Have you understood the interpreter? This is, of course, if you use an interpreter. Is there anything you would like to add today? This is important. They're always supposed to ask you this because during the interview, you don't get to just say what you want. You don't get to just sort of tell your story. Rather, the officer is going to ask you question after question after question. They're constantly interrupting you. They're changing topics frequently. And some of them are trying to get you to mess up and make mistakes so they'll have an excuse to deny you. But basically, you don't control the interview. The officer does. They take it where they want to go. And you might not get the chance throughout it to really tell them things that you think are important to your case. So at the end, they have to ask you this question. Is there anything else you'd like to add or anything else you want to tell me that we haven't already talked about? And it's your chance to say whatever you want. It's kind of it's not actually that helpful because the officer will also probably cut you off when you do this if you try to say too much. But You don't have to say yes to this. If you've already covered everything that you think is important, you can just say, no, thank you, officer, nothing to add. That's completely fine. In fact, that's actually nice to the officers. It's music to the officers' ears. They love hearing this because by this time they're tired of the interview and they just want to be done. So when you say this, they're like, yes, we don't have to keep adding more. But if there's something that you haven't talked about that's relevant to the key aspects of your case, like showing that you've been persecuted or that you're likely to be persecuted and that persecution is on account of your possession of one of the protected grounds, then yeah, you should use this opportunity to bring it up. All right. Is there anything that we've not talked about and you think is important to your case that you would like me to know? It's kind of another way of asking that last question, but they do often ask it in multiple ways. Do you feel like you've had an adequate opportunity to express yourself and tell me about your case? And do you have any questions for me? All right. Internal relocation questions. So what is this internal relocation all about? Well, remember I said up top, it's basically the idea that, okay, if you could go somewhere else in your country and be safe, you should just do that. Now, this is usually not an issue when the government is the persecutor, but when it's a private actor, then this is really important because with the government, there's an assumption that, well, it's the government, they control the whole country, they could probably find you anywhere, so you wouldn't really be safe. But with private individuals who are not from the government, the idea is, well, you could probably get away from them. How would they even know if you went somewhere else? So that's the question is, could you go somewhere else and be safe? But also, would it be reasonable to expect you to do so? Like, are there any problems with you going somewhere else? Like, would you have access to proper medical care? Is there other danger that you could face there? Things like that. And so these are some of the questions along those lines. Have you previously tried moving within your country, like to a different city or region, to avoid being harmed? If not, why not? And if you did try that, where did you go? And what happened there? Did the people that you fear find you there? So if you say, well, yeah, I went, to this different town several hours away by car and I tried to lay low, but they found me there. I got a note slipped under my door there that said, you thought you could run. You can never hide from us. We found you. That would be good for you to help convince the asylum officer that, look, they can find me anywhere. All right. So if they found you there, how do you think it is that they learned where you were? How'd they find it out? Would you be safe from the people you fear if you just moved elsewhere within your country? So that's looking toward the future. Now what if you were to go back and just move somewhere else? Could you be safe? If not, what makes you think this? Like, why wouldn't you be safe? In other words, how would they find you? How would they know where you were? If you moved to a large city, how would the people that you fear find you? Is there anything about moving to a different place within your country that would be especially hard on you or your family members? And this is important to point out this distinction that for purposes of deciding whether you've been persecuted and whether you will be persecuted in the future in terms of the severity of the harm, all the officer cares about is you. Your family could get persecuted very badly, and that would not help you win asylum unless the officer thinks that shows that you too are at risk. But really what they care about is the harm to you for purposes of persecution. But it's a little bit different when the officer is doing this analysis about internal relocation. When they're deciding whether it would be reasonable for you to internally relocate, they are looking at harm or anything really hard that your family would face. So in addition to just you, your family is relevant for this issue of internal relocation. So think about that. For example, would it be hard for you or your family here, we could say, to get a job outside of the region that you fled? Do you have a support system like friends and family outside of the region that you fled? Does anyone in your family have educational or medical needs that could not be met in regions of your country other than the one you fled? Is there anywhere in your country that the government does not effectively control such that you could be safe there? Okay, we're on to firm resettlement. And remember, the issue here is, were you physically present in some other country after fleeing your country and before coming to the United States in which you had permanent residence or an offer to get permanent residence? So questions around this are going to be, what countries, if any, were you in after your last departure from your own country and before entering the United States? Everyone will get this question. Even if you indicate in your application form that you did not pass through any other countries, they're still going to ask you this question. And then if you say that you were in another country, you're going to get a bunch of follow-up questions about about firm resettlement. So follow-up questions would be something like, okay, well, if you were in some other country, what was your legal status there? And by the way, even having a layover in an airport, like if you have to catch a connecting flight, even that counts as being in another country. So when the officer asks, oh, were you in any other countries after last leaving your country and before getting to the United States? If you just had to change planes in some country on the way, you need to say yes and explain what you did. And they're going to ask you, okay, what was your legal status there? What was your immigration status? Were you able to stay indefinitely there with that status? Like, if you wanted to, did that status allow you to just, and if so, well, why did you leave that country? Did you apply for permanent residence or any other kind of long-term immigration status there? And if not, why not? You don't have to have applied for it and to be able to get asylum in the United States, but they still want to know like why you didn't. If you could have, if you were somewhere else where you could be safe, why didn't you seek asylum or some kind of refuge? Did your spouse apply for such status? Your spouse getting permanent residence in another country and being in that country will not keep you from getting asylum when you're the principal applicant. But it could, if they got permanent residence, it could indicate that you had it, or at least you were eligible for it, and maybe even you had it and you didn't even realize it. And so that would be. If your spouse was granted permanent residence, would you be allowed to stay there too on the basis of your spouse's status? If you could have gotten status through your spouse, why didn't you do so? Did you have permission to work legally in the country that you were in? If so, were those rights unlimited or were they restricted? They ask questions like this about what the conditions of your status there were or what conditions were placed on you, because it can be relevant to determining whether the status that you had was actually permanent status. And also there's limited exceptions to the rule that says you can't get asylum here if you are firmly resettled elsewhere. And one of those exceptions is basically if you were treated in a way that was just not like a true permanent resident, but you were really restricted. Like if the government said, okay, people in this status can only work in this certain zone or in these certain sectors, and they can't travel freely throughout the country. If the government put a bunch of conditions on your life there, then you might not be barred by the firm resettlement bar, even if you had permanent. Okay. And so along those lines, were you treated differently there in that country than that country's citizens because of your limited immigration status? And if so, how? In what way? Were you discriminated against in trying to get a job because you were a foreigner or because of your immigration status? Did you experience xenophobic insults or attacks? If you had status in the country based on your employment, could you keep renewing that status indefinitely? This gets into what can be a pretty tricky area where a status that does not say that it's permanent, it's not called permanent residence, could in some cases be considered to effectively be permanent residence if you can just keep renewing it indefinitely, very easily with like no conditions on your ability to renew it indefinitely. So what did you have to do to renew your status? If you lost your job, what would happen to your immigration status? This is relevant because many people have some kind of long-term status in a country based on their job, but they would lose it if they lost their job. So it's not really permanent. Like we see this very often in the Middle East with like United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, where people from other countries will go there and live maybe their whole lives. They might be born there and not be a citizen of that country and stay their whole life on their parents' work-based, employment-based status or eventually their own employment-based status, but it's still not permanent residence. Okay? Could you have remained there legally if you no longer had the job that originally allowed you to get legal status there? Would you be allowed to stay there long-term if you went back right now? Did you apply for asylum or other humanitarian protection in the third country? If not, why not? Were you physically harmed or threatened in that country? This can help establish that you were not firmly resettled. If you were in danger and the authorities couldn't or wouldn't protect you, then you will not be barred from asylum in the United States by the firm resettlement bar. Do you fear being harmed there if you had to go back there? If so, who would harm you and what would motivate them to do that? All right, let's move on to the 1-year filing deadline. This is responsible for lots and lots of asylum denials because the person has filed outside of their first year in the United States, meaning they came here and more than 1 year passed before they finally applied for asylum. The rule is that you have to file during your first year, but there's a couple of categories of exceptions. And so if it becomes clear that you did not file during your first year, the officer is going to ask you a lot of questions about this to try to determine whether you might qualify for one of the categories of exceptions. Okay. So they're going to be questions like, did anything happen or was there anything going on in general that made it hard for you to apply for asylum during your first year in the United States? If so, what was happening and how did it affect you? Did you find it hard to concentrate and perform routine tasks like taking care of yourself? These are the kinds of questions that go toward an exception called the extraordinary circumstances exception, which says essentially that if there was some extraordinary circumstance during your first year here that kept you from being able to reasonably be able to apply for asylum, then you get an excuse. And so that's what the officer's getting at with these kinds of questions. Like if you're super depressed or injured or ill, if you had cancer and you're constantly in treatment and you're weak from that and can't concentrate for months at a time, that could serve as an extraordinary circumstance exception to the 1 year filing deadline. All right. Did you work while you were going through the challenges that you were facing, whatever those were? Were you able to actually go to your job? Because if you did, if you were able to do things like, oh, I could work, did my full-time job, I took care of my kids, I did all these things, then the officer will probably think, oh, it really wasn't that bad. You should have been able to apply for asylum if you could do all those other things. All right. During this challenging time, did you care for your children? And were you able to do things like grocery shop, cook, and tend to things like paying your... Did you have physical, medical issues or mental health problems during your first year here that made it difficult to get things done? Did anything happen during your first year in the United States that makes you think that you're at greater risk now of being harmed in your country than was previously the case? Actually, this is relevant. This issue of new things happening that make you think that you're at risk is relevant anytime, not just during your first year. At any time, if something happens, whether it's during your first year, during your second year, during your 10th year here, if something happens and you think now, okay, now I'm really at risk. Now there's a better chance of me being persecuted on account of a protected ground. That can be what's called a changed circumstance. So I said there's two categories of exceptions. One is called extraordinary circumstances, and the other is called changed circumstances. So that's what this question is getting at. And if something has changed, can you describe exactly what happened or changed? And what exactly is it about this change that puts you at greater risk? Did you hire a lawyer to help you with your immigration matters during your first year in the United States? If so, did they tell you about the 1 year filing deadline for asylum? And what did they advise regarding a potential asylum filing? Those questions surrounding the lawyer are relevant because if you hired a lawyer and you got bad advice, or if they just failed to file your application on time during your first year, that can serve as an excuse. It falls under the extraordinary circumstances category of excuses or exceptions to the 1 year filing deadline. So you can expect questions about whether you had a lawyer and if so, what they did and whether they messed up basically, and that kept you from filing timely. Okay. All right. Now we are to some of the case specific questions that you can expect to get if these kinds of circumstances are present in your matter. So if you were ever arrested or detained, get ready for some questions like this. So who arrested or detained you? What government entity was it? Are they from? And how do you know this? How do you know that? Next, what did they say while arresting you or transporting you to detention? The officer wants to know what they said, okay? And often they ask about what they said while they were arresting you or taking you away to detention. What did they say when you first arrived at the jail or detention site? Did they ever explain why you were being detained? Next up, we've got for about how many hours were you detained in total, or that could be how many days or weeks or months or years. Basically, how long were you detained in total? Did they give you enough water to drink during detention? Did they give you enough food to eat? How big was the cell or room in which you were held? By the way, all of these things, these last few questions all go to severity. They all are relevant for determining whether the harm that you suffered is severe enough to count as persecution. How many people were in the cell? Was there a bed or anything for you to sleep on, or were you on the floor? Was the temperature kept perhaps extremely cold or extremely hot? Did you have access to a proper restroom? If not, where did people go to the restroom? So if people just had, if you're in a small crowded cell and people just had to go to the bathroom in the corner and it's dirty and it's getting on people and it smells terrible, those things are relevant to your claim for establishing that you suffered persecution. Was there urine and fecal matter near you on the floor? Where did you use the restroom? Did the guards do anything to make you afraid or uncomfortable, like play loud music or shine bright lights to keep you from sleeping? Basically, did they do anything to make you uncomfortable or to torture you? What made the conditions of your detention hard or painful? Okay, let's talk about politics for people who are politically active or who are being targeted for harm because of their political opinions, or at least what the government believes or private actors believe to be the applicant's political opinions or activities. So, do you oppose the government of your country? If so, what is it that you don't like about the party that's in power or about their policies? Like what do you oppose? What do you not like? Because sometimes, people will just say, oh yeah, I don't like that party that's in power, and they can't articulate why, and it just doesn't sound very credible if they can't explain why. Are you a member of a political party? If so, which party? And when did you join this political party? What was it that drew you to this party, or what did you like about it? What attracted you to this particular party? For example, what was it that you liked about this particular party that made you want to join them and not other parties of similar ideology? And who is the current leader of your party? The officer figures that if you really are a member of a political party, you probably should know who's the head of it right now. Have you remained involved with your party since you've been in the United States? And if so, how? What activities have you done with or in support of your party? How often did you do these things? Was it like once per month, weekly, only a couple of times, or what? In what month and year did you begin your activities with or in support of your party? In what month and year did you stop doing them? Did you have any kind of leadership role or formal position within your party? Were you involved in political campaigns or in carrying out elections? What activities did you do more specifically in support of the campaign or elections? So what did you do concretely? Have you attended marches or protests against the government? Approximately how many marches or protests did you attend in total? And in what month and year did you first attend a march or protest against the government? And in what month and year did you last attend one? And why did you stop attending marches or protests? What did you do at these protests exactly? You need to be able to explain what you were protesting and what you did during the protest. Did you just walk and chant things? Did you carry a sign? Did you just stand on a corner as the marchers went by? What did you do? Okay. And here's a question to that. And did you carry a banner or sign? And if so, what did it say? And what exactly were you protesting? Were there any specific things that you were opposing or messages that you were trying to send to the government? Has a photograph of you appearing at a protest or other event that could be viewed as anti-government ever been published in traditional media, meaning like newspapers, in your country or perhaps on social media? In other words, is there a photo of you out there or video of you out there somewhere circulating that clearly shows you protesting the government that the government could see and be mad about? Do you have pictures that you can show me of you participating in protest or doing activities with or in support of your political party? Basically, any photos that look like you're doing something with your party can be. Are you a Fulbright scholar? Have you ever worked for or been associated with U.S. companies or the U.S. government? Fulbright scholar is this prestigious scholarship that people can get to come study in the United States, and in a lot of countries, it's associated with, or people in these countries think that you're some kind of U.S. spy or working for the U.S. government in some way if you get this scholarship. So they think that you oppose their government if their government is not friendly with the United States, okay? Or if you've ever worked for or really been associated with U.S. companies or the U.S. government, you might be viewed as like a spy or against the government of your country, okay? Have you ever posted anything on social media that could be considered critical of your government? If you have, then that may put you on the government's radar. It may make them want to harm you. And so if you've done that, what did you say? Do you have records of this that you can show me? If so, what did you say exactly? If you were to go back to your country, how would the people from the government know that you have political opinions that don't line up with those of the government? Because, a lot of people don't express their political opinions that openly, but they're still afraid that the government might view them as anti-government. But the question here is like, okay, well, how would they know that? Like, you've never protested before. You've never criticized the government on social media. How would they even know that you're against the government? Okay. All right. Have the people that you fear ever called you names or said anything that indicates that they view you as opposing the government in your country, like calling you a traitor or oppositionist, or perhaps use a derogatory term that's commonly employed in your country to refer to the political opposition? The idea here is, have they called you names that indicate that they think that you oppose the government? Have you ever reported or attempted to make public any waste, misuse of funds, or any other kind of government corruption or abuses? Basically, have you been what we would call a whistleblower, or someone who criticized or shined a light on bad things the government has done? Because if they retaliate against you for this, that can count in some cases as persecution on account of a political. And so if so, what did you report? How did you report it? And to whom? Were you retaliated against after you reported the corruption? And if so, in what way? What makes you believe that what happened to you was a consequence of your reporting of the corruption? So if something did happen and you think it's because you exposed corruption, what can you point to that indicates that, yeah, that's why? Like, was there something that the bad guys said that clearly connects the two events, or is there circumstantial evidence? Next, before going to the authorities outside of your place of work, did you report the problem up your chain of command? This question assumes that the person worked like in the government and they became aware because of that, of wrongdoing, and they exposed it. Okay. So this question's asking, well, before you went, to the journalists or to the NGOs and told them about it, did you first report the problem like to your superior and their superior? The next question, next we've actually got a different kind of case of sexual minorities. This just basically means any member of the LGBTQ plus community. So this term, sexual minorities, that's the term that USCIS uses to refer to the particular social group consisting of anyone who is not heterosexual. Okay. They also include in this not just sexual orientation, but gender identity. Okay, so if you're like any kind of non-conforming gender identity or a member of the LGBTQ plus community, you would fall in USCIS's view in this category of what they call sexual minorities. Okay, so question 300, what is your sexual orientation or identity? For example, do you consider yourself to be gay, bisexual, or perhaps something else? Do you have a gender identity that is considered atypical in your country? And if so, what is it? When you were growing up, what did your family and those in your community say about sexual minorities? Were you teased or harassed at school or in the neighborhood because you did not act in a way that people expect someone of your sex to act? We very often see this with effeminate boys getting bullied because people say that they're too girly or something like that, something ridiculous like that. It happens a lot, and that is relevant to your case. If you are religious, what does your religion teach about sexual minorities? And was this something on which your family focused when you were growing up? The way that society, including religions and families, view sexual minorities and the things they say about them matter. If you're constantly hearing from everyone around you, oh, it's bad, it's a sin, or you shouldn't be like this, that can actually count as harm. And if you combine it with, or if there's enough of it, or if you combine it with other modes or incidents of harm, it can get you to the level of persecution. Okay. Have you been excluded or shunned from your religious community over your sexual orientation or gender identity? The idea here is that, everyone should have the right to practice the religion they want to practice and shouldn't be excluded from it over sexual orientation or gender identity. And so that can be harm as well. Has it been hard to get jobs, or have you perhaps been treated unfairly at work because of your sexual orientation or gender identity? Have you ever harmed yourself or thought about harming yourself because of the harassment and hardship you've endured over your sexual orientation or gender identity? When did you first really understand that you were gay? And this line of questioning that we're getting into now is for the purpose of the officer drawing the conclusion that you are gay or a member of the LGBTQ plus community, because sometimes people do lie about this, right? People from certain countries will sometimes know that, okay, if someone from my country is gay, they will get asylum in the United States, and therefore I'm going to lie about it. I'm going to pretend that I am. So you actually do have to convince the asylum officer that you really are a sexual minority. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's just how it is. And so they're going to ask you questions that they would expect a person who is from a sexual minority community to be able to answer. The kind of things that the asylum officer figures that, okay, if you lived this experience, then you should be able to talk about these experiences that someone like this has experienced. So it's like questions like, what was your own journey? Tell me about your journey. For example, when did you first understand that you were gay, or whatever the case may be? Okay. Did you tell anyone when you first realized this? And if not, why not? When did you first tell someone about your sexual orientation? Whom did you tell? And how did they react? Did you know other gay people in your home country? If so, how are they treated? Does your family know that you are gay? If so, what was their reaction when they found out? Have you ever been in a same-sex relationship? If so, how did the two of you meet? Okay, 320. How long were you together? Did you ever live together? And are you currently in a relationship? And if so, is it a same-sex relationship? Have you been sexually intimate with someone of the same sex as you? And how do gay people meet one another in your country? Were you involved in any LGBTQ plus organizations in your country? And are you involved in any of those organizations here? When you say people in your country want to kill people like you, can you explain what you mean by people like you? This is because sometimes asylum applicants won't want to use the word gay or bisexual to describe themselves. They're kind of reluctant to do it just because of the challenges they've had with that, especially probably in their home country. And so they might say things like, oh, people like me, without wanting to straight up just say gay or bisexual, whatever the case may be. And so sometimes the officer will ask questions like this to try to explore that more. Okay. Have you had a relationship with a gay person while in the United States? And how many partners have you had in the United States? Were you romantically intimate with them? Were you physically intimate with them? Those are kind of the same thing, but they could be a little bit different. Did you live together? Are you living openly gay while in the United States? Have you ever had an account on a gay dating app like Grindr? Have you ever attended a pride parade or any LGBTQ plus events? Do you have any photos of yourself at a pride event that you could show me? Do you have any text or social media direct messages you can show me of you communicating in a flirtatious way with someone of the same sex? If you could live openly gay in your country without fear of being harmed and without negative social stigma attaching to you, would you want to do so? In other words, do you want to live your life openly gay or openly bisexual or whatever you may be? If you could do that safely, would you want to do that? Do you want to get married someday to someone of the same sex as you? If so, could you do that legally in your own country? Is being gay or having same-sex relations a criminal offense in your country? What do the authorities in your country do when someone goes to them over harm or threats based on their sexual orientation? Do the authorities take those kinds of reports seriously? All right, we are up to religious conversion. So someone who has changed religions, and that's why they're afraid of being harmed in their country. So were you born into a religious family? And if so, what was the religion? Growing up, did you consider yourself to be an adherent of that faith? Or in other words, did you consider yourself to be a follower of that faith? Growing up, did you attend services or do other things in observance of your faith? And if so, about how often did you do these things? And when did you stop doing them? When did you begin being interested in a religion other than the one you previously associated with? Or when did you begin to think that your old religion might not be the right faith for you? Similar to the questions we just went over for the LGBTQ plus community, for religious conversion, the officer wants to know a lot about your journey and how you got to where you are now with regard to your faith, okay? So what caused you to start considering that your old religion might not be a good fit for you? And how did you get interested in your new religion? Who introduced you to it? When were you introduced to the new religion? What did you think about the new religion when you first began learning about it? Like, what were your impressions? What caused you to become more serious about possibly embracing the new religion? Was there a particular thing that happened that made you decide to go ahead and fully embrace the new religion, leaving your old religion behind? This question is trying to ask whether there was some incident that, or something that happened that was really a turning point where you really said, you know what, I'm ready to go all in and adopt this new religion. Okay, if so, what was it and when did it happen? What is it about your new religion that you found so compelling that you left your old religion for it? In other words, what drew you to the new religion, or what is it that you like so much about it? What are some of your favorite things about your new religion? Have there been key relationships with people that have led you to become a member of your new religion or to grow in your faith as a member of your new religion? If so, who are they and when did you meet them and what did they do in this regard? Are there people who have seen you grow in your faith, such as by being around you in the early days of the conversion process and then continuing to be around you more recently? In other words, is there someone who's really familiar with your faith journey? Do you go to a place of worship for your new religion? If so, where and how often do you go? Have you ever held any leadership positions in your new place of worship or any other religious organizations? If so, what were the organizations? And what was your position? What did you do in that role or position? And when did you do it? What activities do you do with your place of worship or activities related to your faith? Like, what do you actually do? And how often do you do them? And do you have photos that you can show me of you attending religious ceremonies or doing activities with people from your place of worship? Where do you see things going in the future with respect to your faith? For example, do you perhaps aspire to a leadership role in your place of worship or other religious organizations? And is your faith a crucial part of your identity? Would you like to live openly as a member of your new religion and fear that you would be harmed for this if you had to be in your country? And what do you fear would happen to you if you went to your country and openly practiced your new faith? Who in your country knows that you have changed religions, or does anyone know? And how would the people that you fear in your country know that you renounced your old religion and embraced a new one? Okay, we're on family-based persecution, where someone is targeting you because you're a member of your family. So have the people whom you fear ever said or done anything to indicate that they hate or wanted to punish your family? Is there any reason to believe that the reason the persecutors would target you for harm is that they want to harm your family? What did the attackers say to you about your family when they attacked you? Have they indicated that a good way to punish your parent, spouse, or child would be to hurt you? We see this where someone really wants to get at one of your family members, like say your parent, and they say, I'm going to really teach that parent a lesson. I'm going to do it by hurting their child because I know that hurting their child is the best way to punish the parent. Well, the harm to the child would be harm on account of their membership in the particular social group consisting of immediate family members of the parent. The harm would not happen if it were not for this special relationship between a parent and child. So that's how that works. All right, let's go to domestic violence, okay? So what has your partner done to harm you? Did your partner limit your mobility? Like, did they control where you could go, such as by locking you in a room or forbidding you to leave the house? Were you able to freely communicate with others? Did they try to keep you away from friends and family? Did they force you to have sex when you did not want to? Did they tell you to keep what was happening a secret? What adjectives did they use to describe you? Like, did they call you demeaning or mean names or make fun of you, criticize you? Did they ever say things like, you belong to me or I own you? This is relevant for establishing that the harm was on account of your membership in a particular social group that USCIS calls women, or it could be men, viewed as property by virtue of their position in a domestic relationship. That's how USCIS formulates this particular social group. Did they make you do lots of chores or perform other work? And if so, did they make you do it for long hours or perhaps under difficult conditions? Were you able to attend school or work outside of the house, or did they keep you from doing these things? Did they control all the money, making you financially dependent on them? Did you ever try to assert yourself? And if so, what happened when you did it? Did you ever try unsuccessfully to leave your partner? If so, what happened when you tried to leave? Did they find you and somehow force or convince you to come back? Did the abuse stop once you were finally able to leave? Have they continued to do things to harm you or to threaten you? Do you think they would continue to harm you if you went back to your country? What makes you think they would find and harm you if you just went and lived with someone else? All right, we're going to talk briefly about female genital mutilation, sometimes called female genital cutting. When, if this is something that you suffered, when did you suffer FGM? How old were you? What do you remember about that day? Who did this to you? Who mutilated you? Was it extremely painful? The answer to that is probably pretty obvious, but you're going to get this question all the same. Did your parents express an opinion for or against FGM ever? Did you or your spouse express an opinion for or against FGM at any moment? This question is actually for you're afraid that someone will do FGM to one of your children, like to your daughter, and you oppose it. If you say, no, I don't want this to be done to them. I'm against FGM. I think it's bad. I think that it should not happen. That can actually serve as a viable protected characteristic for purposes of getting asylum. Who else in your family has suffered FGM? Did you feel ashamed or sad after the incident if you were mutilated by FGM? Did it cause pain for a long time after the incident? Do you still suffer consequences from FGM today? Many women still do, and that's relevant, and you need to tell the officer about it if you still have problems from it, okay? Do you have nightmares or become sad or fearful when you think about what you went through? Were you able to have a normal sexual life? For example, do you find sex painful or unenjoyable because of what you've endured? Have you had children? And if so, were you able to give birth naturally or as opposed to having a C-section? What do you now think about FGM? Do you oppose it? Like, are you against it as a practice? Have you expressed this opposition publicly or at least to family members? Do you fear someone will harm you if you refuse to allow your daughter to be subjected to FGM? What makes you think someone will harm you for this reason? Are you aware of anyone in your family or tribe who has been harmed because they opposed FGM or because they refused to let their child be subjected to it? And what would the authorities say if you went to them over your fear of being harmed over your opposition to FGM? And how would your family or tribe find you if you moved to another city or region in your country? All right, quickly, we're going to finish by talking about gangs when the bad guys are gang members. So what do you think it is about you that is causing the gang to want to recruit you or which may make them want to harm you? What about you in particular is making you the target? Do you regret the fact that the gang is so powerful in your community and view them as a negative force in society? It's kind of complicated why the officer's asking this, but it's definitely sometimes relevant, so you should be prepared for it. Have you ever spoken against the gang or criticized them? And have you done anything else that makes the gang view you as an opponent to the gang? Do you oppose the gang perhaps on religious grounds? And has the gang ever said anything about your religion, like made fun of it or made fun of you for being religious? And that's it. That's 428 asylum questions to expect in your case. Listen, give us a call if you want to talk about this in detail, if you want to talk with us about what's going on with your situation and have us assess whether we might be able to help you win asylum in the United States. Our phone number is 713-909-0401. Again, it's 713-909-0401. I'm Brian Manning, and as always, it's truly a pleasure and an honor to serve you in your asylum journey.